While China's economy is slowing down, the country is looking toward innovation to help drive its economic future. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. China's economy is in flux right now. A turbulent stock market and currency are perhaps sign of a country in transition. For analysis on China's economic slowdown, CCTV's Wang Tongshuan joins us from Beijing. And Tongshuan, China's economy isn't off to the best start in 2016. What's going on and what's the economic outlook?
Well, Anand, there are two things we need to understand really. One is the long-term structural reform policy the government has implemented, which is to change its old model for growth based on investment and export into a consumption-led one. Another issue is a short-term cycle in 2016 around this trend. Bear in mind that the global financial crisis in 2008 badly affected two of China's major trading partners, the United States and the United Union. That means the demand for China's goods and services has been declining. In other words, investment in this sector has become less attractive. So when a strong international demand isn't there, the domestic market has to fill the gap and create that demand. Prices has to go down. And now it comes to the short-term issues. The weak stock market and the depreciation of yuan top investors' concerns. The stock market has already fallen about 20% since the start of this year. Many believe that is due to the fall in manufacturing activity, which in turn can be attributed to weak new orders, exports and production activities. Businesses in China are clearly focused on reducing overcapacity in many industries. And meanwhile, although a moderate depreciation of yuan, the Chinese currency, might boost exports, a sharp drop in its value could cause capital flight. This would create a self-fulfilling currency crisis and have a negative feedback effect on real economy. So making a smooth transition to a consumption-led economy growth is a big challenge for 2016, Anand.
Right, and in making that transition, what are the specific steps the Chinese are taking to tackle these challenges?
Well, according to the Chinese government, in the years ahead, we can expect to see sustainable growth from innovation and technology. That's really up to the government, which needs to design economic policies that will encourage innovation. For example, finance policies which channel more financial resources into small and medium-sized companies, or more moderate tax cuts which can help companies innovate and pursue long-term goals which sustain economic spending. And as Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has said many times in this year already, a strong effort will be made to advance structural reform. Those efforts include an innovation-driven development strategy and promoting mass entrepreneurship. Worth mentioning that China has a population of 1.3 billion, a 900 million strong workforce, and 150 million skilled professionals. The Chinese Premier also said the economy growth will depend less on natural resources and more on human resources. And he said he's very confident that China has the capacity to maintain a medium to high growth and achieve medium to high levels of development. And that will certainly give a boost to the global economy, Anand.
Thanks, Tongshuan. That's CCTV's Wang Tongshuan reporting from Beijing. Joining me now is Jin Carew, an economics professor at the London School of Economics. Carew, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
China's growth rate forecast for 2016 is put at the 6.5 to 7% range. Now, we know that previous growth rates have been much higher. What is responsible for the current slowdown?
Well, part of it is just simply that the model of growth has changed. So we're transforming from a growth model that relies on industrial goods and manufacturing into something else. Now, that something else is not necessarily consumption, but it should be more based on sustainable growth models, like, based on innovation and efficiency. So right now what we're seeing is reducing excess capacity, and the fact that China is transitioning away from a very easy kind of low-hanging fruit kind of economic growth model to something that relies on better institutions, which is more difficult.
Now, these changes that you talk about, some analysts refer to it as the new normal. This new normal, is it going to cause instability in the markets, more instability?
Well, first of all, I want to question whether there really is a new normal or not. I think the problem is that the hard work has just begun. It's not that China's growth potential is over or that it has to be shifted to something completely different or that we're entering a so-called middle income trap. It's just that relying simply, the growth on subsidizing firms, subsidizing exports, preferential tax treatments, cheap labor, cheap, capital for state-owned enterprises, that cannot be sustained. So what I think is really going on is that the hard part, which is to reform politically in order to push through the economic reforms, is just becoming more difficult. That's why we're seeing slowing growth. Now, is that going to cause instability in the markets? A lot has to do with how the government communicates with the market and the perception. I think in China and elsewhere, there's a general anxiety about where China is going, and that kind of market sentiment is causing more volatility than the actual economic fundamentals itself.
How does the Chinese currency, the renminbi, how does that factor into the changes we are talking about right now? I mean, will it depreciate? Could we see a large devaluation? And how would that affect the country's desire to become part of the IMF's strategic drawing rights basket?
Well, opening up is very much part of China's reform program. Indeed, it's one of the most important ones going forward. So exchange rate volatility, whether you like it or not, is just a fact of life, as well as other kinds of financial volatility, which China was able to be shielded from for a long period of time. But as China opens its doors, it's just going to have to see a lot of volatility. Now, with the depreciating currency, I think it has a lot to do recently with the market sentiments. Again, the stock market crash, a lot of anxiety on the part of the Chinese consumers who are eager to take their money out because they're just simply not sure about the growth prospects and about what the government is going to do. But taking a step back, one has to realize that the real exchange rate does revert to some equilibrium value. We always see that in the data after a while. So I think in the long run, China's exchange rate is not overvalued. In some sense, if its growth potential is realized, Chinese currency should still appreciate. So I want to make the distinction between short-term and long-term movements in the exchange rate. I think short-term, because of sentiment, because of the general economic condition, because of the external conditions, such as the U.S. Fed tightening, we are likely going to see capital outflows. But if China also opens its doors in terms of inflows, we might as well see also an appreciation sometime in the medium run as well.
What about consumer confidence in China? Do consumers think that business conditions will improve in 2016?
Well, I think there are many different layers. Now, one of my worries about the Chinese economy is that the private firms or the private companies are finding a really, really hard time to compete with state-owned enterprises who, again, has these, access to capital, ease of access to capital and preferential treatments, and they're big monopolies. So the economic conditions or the survival conditions of private firms are difficult. Many of these firms, worryingly enough, are turning to investing in the stock market and the property market rather than focusing on their core businesses, which means that their general competitiveness will be eroding. So on that, I am slightly concerned. And I think that consumer confidence, well, it's also weak at the moment. Now, whether the Chinese consumers will still pick up in terms of consumption, that's a completely different issue. But for now, the market sentiment is very much worrying, and also social instability, which is a very important part of the government's concern, is also a potential threat.
Well, let's look at one other aspect of the Chinese economy, one other sector, and that is Chinese internet companies. How will they perform in the year ahead? Is this going to be a bright spot?
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. I think the consumer/service industries will flourish. As we've seen in the past experience, when the Chinese government decide to liberalize a sector or allow the private companies to compete fairly, these sectors do extremely well. Now, the Chinese government, along with this opening up and reform program, is not going to liberalize certain sectors, which they call the artery of the Chinese economy, which includes the finance and banking industry, but they will liberalize the downstream sectors, especially the consumer-oriented sectors. And internet companies in China are doing amazingly well. They have very large domestic market. They can locally adapt, and technological innovation, R&D, etc., will help push these firms along.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for being with us. Carew joining us there from London. We are going to take a break right now. Coming up, we dive into the world of Chinese innovation with a venture capitalist and an entrepreneur. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China's current economic outlook. One of the ways the Chinese government hopes to grow its economy is through encouraging innovation. Joining me now from Beijing is Li Zhefei, Chinese entrepreneur and CEO of startup Mobwai. From Shanghai, Todd Embley is program director at China Accelerator, a tech incubator. And from Silicon Valley, Glenn Solomon is managing partner of GGV Capital, a venture capital firm specializing in Chinese investment. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Glenn, let me start with you. We know that countries around the world compete for foreign investment. Why is China an attractive investment right now?
At GGV Capital, we've based our business on investing in both the U.S. and China and the convergence in those two markets. And on, if you look at the global economy, U.S. and China are the two biggest economies. They're increasingly intertwined, particularly as it relates to technology. The world is getting flatter, and we're seeing in areas like mobile and connected devices, for example, that the U.S. and China keep getting closer together. So there's opportunities out there that we see to invest in companies that are taking advantage of that convergence in both the U.S. and China.
Right, and you have investors investing in each other's country, I guess.
That's right. We have one team. We're one partnership across both markets. In fact, I was just in China all last week, and my partners in China come over to the U.S. frequently as well. And many of our companies take advantage of the fact that we're in both markets. They might be producing their products in one market and selling in the other, or vice versa, taking advantage, again, of the opportunities that exist in both markets.
Zhefei, we just heard our reporter tell us earlier on about China's new direction, talking about innovation now in China, and you are the embodiment of China's new direction. You started a company called Mobwai, which focuses on artificial intelligence. You've attracted investment from Google. Tell us about your venture.
Yeah, so let me give you an introduction about our company. My company is called Mobwai. We started this company in 2012. It's an artificial intelligence company, and we're trying to create a new human-computer interaction experience for voice search. And our company attracted investment from Sequoia and SIG and Google recently.
Okay, let's go to Todd. Todd, you're program director at China Accelerator, described as an innovation incubator. How does China Accelerator work?
Well, it's just like most other accelerators, the same as Techstars or 500 Startups or Y Combinator. We run a 3-month program. We help the startups go from almost zero to investment. We provide them with a lot of mentorship, with a lot of guidance, with a lot of network, and a lot of backing, because we're backed by SOSV, the Accelerator VC, who is also interested in follow-on funding all of the companies that go through the program.
Glenn, you're an investor, you invest money, you expect a good return on that money, but how does one evaluate the viability and quality of, let's say, a Chinese innovation startup?
It's a great question. Having been in the market for 15 years at GGV in China, we've seen a lot of changes over that time period. And I'd say over the past 5 years in particular, you've seen the emergence of a class of entrepreneur who's much more experienced than in prior periods. Many of the folks that we're backing at companies in China have worked for the Alibabas, the Baidus, the Tencents already, and have had experience then in growing businesses with really good management teams, so have seen what that's like. So they're not first-time people any longer. They're very experienced and are attacking a very big market in China where there's still a lot of opportunity. And so when you combine big market with experienced entrepreneur, that's what we get very excited about. So we see plenty of that now in China, and we're investing aggressively in China despite some of the concerns that are being raised about the macroeconomic environment.
Right, I was going to ask you about that. So investors are not deterred in any way by the fact that there's a slowdown in the Chinese economy?
I would say that China's had lots of ups and downs over the past 15 years that GGV's been there. And we're very committed to the market. I think that's not true of all the investors in the venture arena that have approached China. So money does come and go, and I'd say we're in an environment now where there is some money that's fleeing the country. That's not the case at my firm at GGV. We're very dedicated and committed to the market. And in fact, we've had some of our best investments during periods when the market was slow, because innovation doesn't slow down for macroeconomic cycles. We've seen great companies created in some of the toughest markets, and our bet is that we'll see the next generation of terrific companies being created now, and if there's less competition for us to invest in them, so be it. That'll be good for us.
Jeffrey, what are some of the challenges that Chinese innovators face right now?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges that the Chinese startup are facing is attract good talents. As you know, there are a lot of good technology companies in China, but the supply of talents still quite little. So it's very difficult for startups to attract top talents because they're facing competition from all those big companies.
Todd, if you look at one model, we see companies like, say, Apple here in the United States. Products are designed in the United States, but are manufactured in China. How does a group like yours, China Accelerator, change that?
Well, I actually think that there's a lot of innovation that happens in China. There's been a lot of talk about how the Chinese copy a lot of companies, or copy a lot of innovation, and I would actually strongly argue against that. I think they take quite a lot of ideas, but they will reverse engineer and then re-engineer and then localize. And I tell you one thing that they're doing is they're innovating a lot on the business model side of things and side of startups. So yes, China has been a large manufacturing hub for a lot of things, especially hardware down south in the Guangzhou region, in the Guangdong region, near Shenzhen. But I think we're going to see a lot more true innovation at the code level of a lot of products and services and softwares coming out of China.
Now, what about money? Are you able to attract the kind of investment you want for startups?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of money here. We talked about the slowdown in China, and I think that it doesn't affect things at the early stage level. I think if you're looking to raise money in a Series C or Series B or Series D level, yes, it could affect those rounds. But I think at a very early stage, there is still a lot of money, and there's a lot of initiatives happening in China right now. Last week, there was a lot of buzz because the Shanghai government released new legislation saying that if any fund had an office in Shanghai, that they could apply for a return on failed investment. So if something they invested in actually died or the company shut down, they could actually apply for up to 40% of that investment to come back at a maximum of 3 million renminbi per year and a total of 9 million renminbi per company. So there's a lot of, they're actually doing a lot of things to work against slowdown and to encourage a lot more investment here in China.
Jeff, you talked a moment ago about some of the challenges that you face, one of them being trying to attract the right type of talent to companies like yours. But what are the benefits of being an innovator in China?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of being in China is really there's a huge market. So whatever you do here, you will attract millions of users. So that's some of the things that we don't see else in the world. Also, because there are a lot of big cities in China, so you can, whenever you create a service, there are a lot of people living in the city, and they can make use of your service. And then you will get a lot of real demand. I think that's really one of the huge advantages in China.
Glenn, how important is it for China to become a powerful innovator?
It's incredibly important, and to echo what Tim mentioned earlier, I think China really is becoming quite the global innovator. That's not something that's well understood in the West, but if you look at things like the patent applications in China or the number of PhDs being honored and granted each year in China, those numbers continue to climb and dwarf the similar numbers in the U.S. And that's just an indication of the quest for IP in China and innovation. And we're seeing that in companies now as well. Certainly business model innovation is a very important part of what's made Chinese startups successful. They say that necessity is the mother of invention in China. That's definitely the case, and we're seeing lots of companies with creative business models that have achieved a lot of success. Alibaba, for example, one of our early portfolio companies, was really the first business on the globe to create the freemium model, which is now used extensively in the U.S. Same is true for virtual items that Tencent popularized and did very well with, which are now very popular in the U.S. as examples. But we're also seeing beyond business model innovation things in harder, deeper IP, hardware and connected devices, lots of innovation going on in China. So you mentioned earlier, looking at Apple, where the design is done in the U.S. and manufacture is done largely in China these days. I think we'll see more and more companies reversing that trend. Xiaomi is a good example of that, a company that's really developing their products, designing, developing, and assembling those products in China, and they've been obviously very successful so far.
Todd, help us understand more about innovation in China. I would imagine that, for companies to be successful, there would have to be some kind of an infrastructure, an ecosystem, the right environment in China for them to thrive. Is it there?
Yeah, I think for all innovation to be successful, to be able to actually take the startups to be a viable business, it does take an infrastructure. I think one of the greatest benefits to doing startups in China is the WeChat environment or Weixin. I think that it's probably the greatest tool that's ever come along for a startup or for entrepreneurs or for founders. It's an amazing environment where you can immediately start talking to customers, you can create group chats, then you can create your service account and subscription account and move over to then a WeChat app. I mean, you've got 700 million users on WeChat, an incredible amount of opportunity to create viral content. You don't have to even code a single line of your product. Meanwhile, you've done tons of work on the product market fit, and you can even accept payments by integrating with the WeChat API for payments. It's probably one of the best things. I think that alone stands as the greatest opportunity for startups that's come along in decades, and it's here in China.
Jifei, if you look at your company, Mobileye, it was the first direct investment by Google into China. Why were they so keen to invest in your company, and what's in it for Google?
Well, our story with Google started from the partnership with Android Wear, the smartwatch operating system. When Android Wear come to China, because Google now is not available in China, so they replaced our voice search engine and use our voice engine to support all the smartwatch, including Huawei and Moto. After this collaboration, and they got a lot of deep discussion with our engineer or product manager, also talk to our users. They realized we're a company that has a similar value as Google. We care about user value, we're data driven, and we have key technology, and we focus on long-term stuff. So then they decided to invest us.
Glenn, what kind of incentives are there for the kinds of investments that you are making in China right now?
Well, again, we're as a venture capital firm, we're focused on trying to earn the highest return we can. And so our motivator is return. And we see the opportunity very much front and center in China to create big return. Despite the fact that there's some concern about overall macroeconomic conditions in China, if you look at the new economy in China, in e-commerce, in travel, and connected devices, the economy remains very strong. Demand is high. Companies in our portfolio in those areas are growing rapidly, and that's an indication that there's still lots more to come. We also see a big opportunity in Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities. There's been quite a bit of innovation and penetration of new economy companies into the top Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, but some of the smaller cities, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, that you'll see continued growth in those markets as well, which will give renewed and continued growth to lots of the companies in the new economy in China.
Todd, last year there were something like 49 startups daily in one area of Beijing, yet we have not, up to now, seen any major Chinese brand take hold worldwide. Will we start to see that in the near future?
I think so. It's, you know, we have a huge cultural barrier for a lot of these companies. And let's face it, you've got 1.4 billion people in China. You're pretty okay sticking around home and doing things right and growing and figuring things out here before you necessarily need to go super global that early. You know, that said, I mean, you're seeing a lot of investment. Baidu has got an innovation center in the Valley now. Alibaba's got places over in the US now. Tencent is spending $120,000 per day marketing WeChat outside of China. So I think they recognize it. They're just not as anxious to get out and get global as, you know, the other companies around the world have. They're quite content to stay at home because they just have such a huge market here that they don't need to go global so quickly.
Okay, gentlemen, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. For articles, videos, and unique online content, visit our website at cctv-america.com. And we're always available on our social media channels. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Weibo. You can find those links on our website. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.